Iran, protests have been sweeping the country. This is, I guess, all been a bit neglected given what's happened in Venezuela and also now Greenland and also Colombia, Mexico. We can go on really. And not only protests, but Donald Trump has suggested that the US could attack Iran, which it's already done. Of course, last year there was war between Iran and Israel. What's going on? Is there now going to be another war? And how likely is there things escalating, there being some sort of conflagration? It's obviously quite a high chance given it happened only a few months ago. There's no better person to speak to than Trita Parsi, who is Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who do really crucial work on international relations, former President of the National Iranian American Council, but also the author of the book, do go out and get this, Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran and the US, which is more than obviously relevant. Great to speak to you. How are you doing?
Good to be with you again.
Always great to speak to you. Let's just start with the protests. So I'm interested, how, I guess, organic are they? Are they, obviously there is a massive economic crisis going on in Iran, partly sanctions and all the rest of it. So how much is it to do with, the kind of the economic side, but also the regime? I'm interested, I don't have any love, obviously, for the Iranian regime. Don't we need to make that clear? But I mean, some of the protesters seem to go very much harking back to the Shah of Iran. That regime was overthrown. It was a very brutal regime in the 70s. It's obviously the father. What do you make of it all?
So, first of all, I think these protests started off undoubtedly, in my view, at least in my assessment, as completely organic as a result of the plunging of the currency, which then prompted protests in the Iranian bazaar, who are the ones that are directly and immediately affected by this. And then I think it has morphed into something else at times. And that's understandable, mindful of the fact that you have not just a terrible, terrible economic situation, but overall a tremendous amount of anger and unhappiness vis-a-vis the government in Iran. And there's no mystery as to why that is, given how repressive it has been, but also how incompetent and how corrupt it has been in delivering basic goods, which has, of course, become even more and more difficult because of sanctions. I think sanctions in this case is actually very much part of the trigger, because sanctions have disabled the Iranians to have access to their own funds, around $120 billion of their assets that are held in other banks in other countries that they can't access to because of financial sanctions, which means that they are very limited in their ability to protect the currency when it is under attack. But what we're seeing so far, and I think I have to make this point, what we're seeing on media reporting and what we're seeing in social media reporting seems to still have a huge delta with what I'm hearing happening on the ground. It is so that people are very upset. People are protesting. The size of this is nowhere near what it was around the time of Mahsa Amini protests in 2022, and absolutely nowhere near what it was in 2009. That doesn't mean that it's insignificant. It doesn't mean that it may not be crucial. But I think it's important to understand that, because when you look at social media, you think that the regime is just about to fall. I don't see that at all. That doesn't mean that they're not unpopular. That doesn't mean that people don't want them to fall. But it means that there's numerous other ingredients that are necessary in order for that to happen. And one of it, of course, is to make sure that actually there is a leadership. We didn't see leadership in the 2022 protests. It caused the protests to fail on some of its objectives, such as getting rid of the regime, but it did absolutely succeed in causing a cultural revolution in Iran, in which the government, the regime, by and large, has really backed off of trying to forcefully enforce the hijab and realizing that society is not going to go back to what it was before. I think that part of the reason is that there is some manipulation of the social media, of what is seen, what is happening, and how it's being promoted. We now have the receipts of seeing that there was a tremendous amount of manipulation taking place during the Mahsa Amini protest, primarily by Israel. And I think we're seeing that again. I think there's a very deliberate effort to give the impression that the son of the former Shah is a key figure in all of this. I don't think he is. I think he's very much trying to portray himself as such. I think there definitely is an element of support for him amongst the protesters. I don't think it's a majority. And I think the supporters have also worked, these bots, etc., have also done everything they can to crowd out internal voices
Huh.
and just put forward Reza Pahlavi. I think this has become particularly important for them after they saw that Trump took over Venezuela, but didn't hand it over to the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who had done everything she could to suck up to Trump, but instead put in place, at least for now, the number two in Maduro's government. And he explicitly said because he didn't believe that she had the ability to govern and that she didn't have support. So I think there's a desperate effort through social media manipulation to give the impression that he has the support and that he has the backing, that he has the competence to be able to do this. So that if there is an effort by the Israelis or by the US to go to war, to do regime change, that they do hand over the country to Reza Pahlavi. So that I think part of the reason why you're seeing this manipulation is precisely for that reason.
Uh, Donald Trump has threatened to bomb Iran, to attack Iran, and the pretext being if protesters are killed, which has happened. I should just make that clear. That hasn't obviously happened yet. I mean, just before we talk about Israel, though I know it's kind of hard to demarcate that one, but what do you think that's plausible? Do you think that an imminent US, let alone before we talk about Israel, a US attack on Iran could happen?
It absolutely cannot be ruled out. I think we have seen not only in the instance of the June war, that I think the Iranians were under the very strong view that it just could not happen. Trump doesn't want war. He's in the middle of negotiations. I myself were quite surprised until the very end that he would do it. It's a different thing that the Israelis would do it, but that
Mm.
he would do it. So I think it would be a huge mistake to discount it when, on the one hand, he says that he will do it. You have the people around him, from Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, who's now constantly showing up around Trump, and certain other people are not being so visible around Trump that have been voices of restraint. But instead, you have Lindsey Graham, who wants to do regime change essentially everywhere and wants to bomb more or less every country. That they're there. I think Trump is on a high based on the military success of the Venezuelan operation, and is committing in some ways the same mistake as the Bush administration did. Remember, Iraq was a success for the first 6 or so months. Libya was a success initially as well. Afghanistan looked like a success initially as well. So these regime change operations did not initially be deemed as failures. In fact, almost all of them were initially leading to euphoria. I mean, you have the mission accomplished image of Bush. So the fact that this was very successful from a military standpoint, within, in a very short term and, 6 days later still is, it's not in any way, shape, or form an indication that this will go down well in the longer run. But Trump is currently on that high, and I think that has made him more susceptible to assess risks in an incorrect way, in which he thinks that these things are much easier than they are, and that one success can be replicated elsewhere. He's even said that we should do more of these. And he's been specifically talking about Latin American countries, but he's also been saying things about regime change in Iran, of course. So I think there is that risk. It would be very foolish of the Iranians to discount it. But then you take in the other variable, which you explicitly wanted to set aside, but I have to bring it back in, which is Israel. In the case of the Israelis, I do think that there is almost a certainty that they will try to attack again. Let me explain why I think this is the case. The initial attack on Iran at the end of the day was not a success for the Israelis. There's a lot of tactical successes they can point to, but the overarching goal was to make sure that they eliminated Iran as a challenger of Israeli maneuverability and hegemony in the region. Turn Iran into a country similar to Lebanon and Syria, which are countries that Israel can attack at will, with impunity, and without American involvement. And that last part is very crucial. I don't think the Israelis felt that they could achieve that in one go. I do think that they thought that they're going to be able to achieve it, go further in achieving it than what they did. And part of the reason why they didn't is because of the effectiveness of Iran's missiles. That really imposed significant damage on the Israelis. I mean, if you take a look at Gaza, for 2 years, you had to drag the Israelis to any ceasefire. And immediately after the ceasefire, they violated it and managed to get out of it entirely after a couple of weeks in most cases. Same thing with Lebanon. But in this case, already after 9 or 10 days, the Israelis started floating the idea of a ceasefire. So, and why is that? And I think the fundamental answer to that is because this was costly to Israel. This was not as simple as they thought it was going to be. But this then means instead of it having, the fact that there's a degree of balance between the two sides, that means that there won't be another war. That may have been the case under normal circumstances. But given what Israel's security doctrine is, which is it does not tolerate that any country in the region can challenge Israel's maneuverability, can deter Israel, that Israel has to have absolute security, and that necessitates that everyone else has absolute insecurity vis-a-vis Israel. That means that you cannot tolerate that Iran has this capability. In fact, if you're sitting in Netanyahu's shoes, he's going to have elections in about 9 months. Those are elections that he cannot um, cancel. This is not like the previous cases in which he could evade the falling of his government by doing, extending the war further, etc. Those elections will happen. And there's a likelihood, of course, that he will lose it. We don't know yet. But if he were to lose it, that means that his legacy will be not that he started a war and defeated Iran, but he started a war and he achieved mutual deterrence, which is exactly the opposite of what his doctrines requires. So I think the Israelis are desperate to start this again, and they're desperate to do so before the Iranians manage to get enough of rebuilding of their air defense systems or other types of help in which the work for Israel would be harder, and desperate to do so before Trump either changes his mind or he gets too deep into the midterm elections in which this would be too risky. That window is closing. I frankly thought that it would have closed by end of December, but perhaps they've managed to extend it a little bit further. But from that standpoint, and from the way that the Israelis look at their own security, which I think is completely erroneous, but nevertheless, that's how they look at it, they're going to attack again. The question has always been, will the U.S. be part of it? Will it just support it defensively, or will the U.S. go all in? And I think the Israeli effort has been to make sure that the U.S. goes all in.
So just to be clear, do you think an Israeli attack on Iran is almost inevitable?
I would say almost inevitable. I think the things that can change it, of course, are elements that are perhaps unforeseen, meaning that something else happens. I mean, imagine if Venezuela had gone really badly, for instance, and the United States would have gone bogged down in its own hemisphere and would have little ability or patience for it. Politically, it would be very dangerous for Trump as well. So there are definitely factors that can cause this not to happen. And I think the window is not eternally open either. But I think that the effort right now from the Israeli side is absolutely to do another attack, make sure that they do move significantly, and they would move significantly if the U.S. is in on the attack, away from any form of mutual deterrence.
In terms of Israel achieving the goals, what strategic goals that you're discussing there, I mean, how likely do you think that would be? Because as you say, it wasn't straightforward last time. And, Israel actually incurred a significant amount of damage, more damage than I think probably the Israeli military and the Israeli state anticipated. But do you think this time, actually, given they haven't been able to rebuild Iran, obviously from the damage they endured last time, that actually Israel this time would just keep on going and would have a good chance of basically eliminating Iran as a significant strategic opponent?
We don't know, because at the end of the day, it requires knowledge of, okay, how much have the Iranians been able to rebuild of their missile stockpile? How much of it do they have? How good have they been in being able to disperse launchers? And how good have they become in terms of using the launchers fast enough so that by the time the Israeli or American detectors realize that a launcher is being activated, that they shoot before the US or Israel can take those out. Towards the end of the war, they managed to become much more effective. They also started to shoot missiles from the eastern part of the country that was more difficult for the Israelis to reach. They combined it with cyber attacks that knocked out Israeli defense systems for just a second or two, but that was sufficient to be able to get through. So they learned a lot. We don't know how much they have learned during the last 6 months, how much they have rebuilt. I think it's very difficult to think that they managed to rebuild their own air defense systems to make it more difficult for the Israelis to attack, because the Israelis, frankly, had a very, very open sky, dominated the skies completely. But that wasn't the deterrence against the Israelis. The Israelis pointed to the fact they never lost a fighter jet or anything like that. Completely true. They just took a lot of hits back home instead of taking on their military up in the air. And then, of course, how much have the Israelis learned? The Israeli air defense systems, despite it being one of the best in the world, several layers of it nevertheless had huge holes. Have they been able to limit those gaps? My understanding is that the Germans have been very much active in helping the Israelis patch that up. How far has that progressed? We have no idea, or at least I have no idea. We also don't know what other Mossad capabilities, assets they have inside the country right now, because that was a crucial element of their attack in Iran. A lot of the attacks of Iran did not happen from the sky coming from Israel. They actually had moved assets into Iran, assembled drones, etc., inside the country and attack from inside, similar to what the Ukrainians had done in some of the most successful attacks they had in Russian territory. So we don't know, did they consume a vast majority of those assets during the June war? Did they keep a lot of them? Last time they felt that they could decapitate the regime by taking out key military officials. Will they this time go after key political officials? Will they have the same success, the same knowledge? Have the Iranians learned anything from the past? Are they using cell phones in the same manner that they did before? So there's a lot of unknowns in this. But if you set that aside, the knowns nevertheless point to more time probably gives the Iranians advantage. More time pushes the US into a sensitive political season that makes it more difficult for Israel to do so. And this is part of the reason I think ultimately you come back to a situation in which is the Israelis are more likely to do it now. And again, we don't have to speculate. Netanyahu was here just 10 days ago, and this was on top of the agenda.
I mean, Iran's leadership, it did warn of the possibility of a preemptive strike against Israel. So this is their newly created defense council, and they issued a statement yesterday. This was set up after the 12-day war last year with Israel. What do you think about that? Is that plausible?
This would be a significant shift from where they have been. It is plausible. How likely it is, I don't know. But I can tell you this. There is a significant rethinking on the Iranian side because they have come to the conclusion that their previous approach was unsuccessful. For years, the Israelis hit Iran inside of Syria, and the Iranians just took the hits, absorbed them, and relied on a strategy that they call strategic patience, saying that, time was on their side. It was better for them to avoid a direct confrontation. It's in Israel's interest to have an earlier confrontation. But that led to a scenario in which the Israelis just moved the goalposts further and further. They became more and more aggressive and audacious in their attacks. And the turning point came when they attacked Iran's embassy inside of Syria. That's when the Iranians started striking back. But even then, the way that they struck back was more demonstrative, performative, and aimed at avoiding further escalation. It was actually aimed at de-escalation. And it didn't work because the Israelis attacked further and even more brazen attacks. Even when the United States did this, when the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, or when they destroyed Fordo, the nuclear plant, the Iranian response, again, was very much designed towards not getting into a direct confrontation with the United States. It's only during the 12-day war that they started to strike back hard. And even then, the tit for tat, the tit were the Israelis, the tat were the Iranians. The Israelis started to striking certain economic interest, and the Iranians started striking Haifa, but not the other way around, not in the sense that the Iranians did this first. So, but the conclusion of that has been that when the Iranians were either de-escalatory or responding proportionately, it backfired on them. And if they want to change matters now, they have to completely do a game changer. Whether that means responding to an Israeli attack by striking Israel completely disproportionately and try to dispel any idea in the Israeli mind that Iran can be subjugated into another Lebanon or Syria, or that, mowing the grass type of thing that is the Israeli strategy in its immediate neighborhood is possible with Iran, or whether that even means attacking the US, whether the US didn't attack Iran, or to attack first, and essentially try to frame it as anticipatory self-defense, which within international law is permissible, meaning if an attack is absolutely imminent, then you can attack first. At a minimum, their intent was clearly to signal that this is something that they're considering. Whether it is very plausible or how likely it is still very difficult to tell. We have not seen this from the Iranians before, but it would also not be surprising if they, at this point, are starting to think in these terms, mindful of the fact that their previous approaches nevertheless led to the Israelis launching a direct war with Iran.
Just finally, what I mean, you kind of you alluded to this before, but in terms of Israel's presence within Iran, I mean, they keep boasting and hinting basically at widespread infiltration of the Iranian regime. I'm just interested, how extensive do you think that happens to be? I mean, we know there has been some infiltration. I mean, we saw that, for example, with the assassination of Hamas's political leader. But and also, do you think that there again, this is what you kind of running through what you've been talking about, is their aim basically to end up with Iran where it's just in chaos, crisis, and with a very weak central government? I mean, that's, in Syria, what their plan clearly is. Just anytime it tries to rebuild militarily or do anything like that, it will just mow the lawn. That's what they always talked about, obviously, in Gaza, you just
Yeah.
said. So just interested in those two aspects.
So the Mossad penetration in Iran obviously has been very, very extensive. I think the regime was taken by tremendous surprise by the degree to which the Mossad had a presence inside the country. In the Israeli media afterwards, essentially what was explained, and again, we have to perhaps take it with a grain of salt, but it does sound plausible to me, was not that necessarily there was a tremendous amount of presence before the war, but rather the Israelis have been very successful in flipping a lot of ordinary Iranians outside of the country or getting them to come outside of the country, train them, and then they slipped back into the country about 3 days before the war. Unrest like what we're seeing today is very helpful for them to be able to do exactly that type of a slipping. If that is the case, it's also important to then recognize that the only reason or the main reason why the Israelis have been successful in doing so is precisely because of the unpopularity of the regime. If the Iranian government had actually pursued a very different approach and really tried to reconcile with society, perhaps it wouldn't even be possible. Who knows? But nevertheless, if they had, I don't think that Mossad had been as successful as they have. That is different, however, from the Mossad penetrating the inner circle of the regime itself. They probably have to a certain extent, but not to the extent that we saw in Hezbollah, for instance, in which they had been able to do it to the point in which they could get these pagers in, they know exactly who to give it to, et cetera, et cetera. We've not seen that in the Iranian case. Perhaps that's a card that the Israelis have and they've decided not to play it yet. But I am of the view that, mindful of the fact that they were trying to decapitate the regime in June, it didn't make sense to have that card and not play it. They may have managed to gain that card since then, but I don't think they had it back then, because if they did it, it just doesn't make sense for them not to have played it. So we don't know exactly the extent of that penetration and at what levels they have it, but we do know they did try to kill the supreme leader, but they couldn't locate him. We know that they did try to kill the supreme leader, the president, but that was because they themselves had managed to infiltrate some of the communication and call for a meeting that had not been called, for instance. So,
Yeah.
there's ways that they've done it that is not necessarily human intelligence or electronic interference or penetration. As to the question of what the end game is for the Israelis, I think it is absolutely crystal clear. The Israelis are not looking for a democratic Iran. I think they're just using Reza Pahlavi and that movement to give a degree of legitimacy for what they're trying to do. They're not, I mean, would they be happy to have like a complete stooge in power that they would be in control over? Probably, but they would probably also recognize that that is not a sustainable situation. That entity would fall at some point. And then you might still have a unified Iran that would still have the capability of being a challenge to you. What you want instead is not regime change, but regime collapse, the collapse of the state as a whole. That very well could lead to civil war, which would be totally fine for them, because that means that Iran's power would be consumed internally and their ability to project power in the region would more or less be eliminated, just like what happened with Iraq. No one is talking about Iraq as a threat any longer because the country, even though it's starting to pick itself up, is just been destroyed. Same thing with Syria. The first thing the Israelis did as soon as Assad fell, they went in and they bombed everything they could militarily to make sure that whatever government would come in place of Assad would not be able to pose a challenge to
So
Israel's dominance. And right now, we're seeing clear efforts in which they have also tried to destabilize Syria and make sure that the government will never be in control of the country as a whole, while they have annexed larger parts of Syria. The same thing is for Iran. And this is why I think it's just an absolutely foolish calculation by some elements to think that the Israelis are looking for democracy in Iran, and as a result, allying with them is a smart move. An Israeli general told me, I think this is 20 or so years ago when I was writing some of these books about this, he said, Iran was once a friend and then it turned into an enemy. It is now an enemy and it can once again turn into a friend, but it can once again after that turn into an enemy. As a result, we can no longer afford to have a strong Iran. We need to make sure that Iran is weak so that we are not affected by whether they are antagonistic or friendly towards Israel.
I think that was a very sobering thought, and clearly the heart of their overall strategy across the Middle East. I went to Baghdad a few months ago, and well, yeah, people came up to me. One guy who's he found out I was British. He said, "You destroyed this country," and that is very much something which is very keenly felt in Iraq
Mm,
today. And really fascinating stuff always from you, Trita. I really, really appreciate it, honestly. Do check
thank
out
you.
everyone. His book, Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the US. Please like, subscribe, leave your thoughts, leave your comments, share the video, make sure everyone hears what he had to say, but really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Owen.